communicated. Professor Polі lecture continues the series of One Lecture to Victory, Speakers of the World in support of Karazinsky National University. And I'm very honored to announce the topic of the lecture today, the evolution of the American Ukrainianist, Ukrainization of schools under Soviet power. Professor Polі is interested in the history of a national identity, childhood and adolescence, education, philanthropy, and medicine. At Michigan State University, he's a core faculty member in the Center for European Studies, Eurasian Studies, and Peace and Justice Studies. Professor Polí's current research project is about the city of children, juvenile poverty, crime, and rescue in Odessa. Professor Polí is the author of the book, Breaking the Tongue, Language, Education, and Power in Soviet Ukraine, which examines early Soviet policy on nationalities and intersection between national identity, education, and childhood. Professor Polí is a member of the advisory board of Age Ukraine and the instructional website 17 Moments in Soviet History, and a full member of Taras Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US. Professor Polí has received enormous number of fellowships and grants, and I am very privileged to say that during the lecture, Professor Polí has kindly agreed and will address Karazin academic community in both English and Ukrainian. And now I'm very happy to step down in favor of Denis Volodymyrovich Zhuravlyov, a Ukrainian historian, a writer, PhD in history, an associate professor and senior lecturer at Vasil Karazin National University, with the words of greeting for Professor Polі, our dear guest. Thank you so much.
Дякую.
Всім доброго вечора. Дуже радий вітати пана Метью із сьогоднішньою нашою зустрічю. І від імені історичного факультету університету Каразіна дуже радий буду послухати про такі вельми актуальні сьогодні речі, як процеси деколонізації, дерадянізації, адже суперечки про них в Україні тривають і сьогодні, щодо їхніх меж, щодо кінцевої мети, щодо методів. Тому для українців, для українських істориків, звичайних громадян, сьогодні вельми важливий погляд іззовні, саме з-поза меж українського суспільства. Причому приємно, що це погляд західного науковця, який зацікавлений українською історією, який добре обізнаний з історією радянською. Сподіваюся, сьогоднішня зустріч з паном Полі допоможе нам всім під новим кутом зору подивитися на український історичний процес історичної давнини. Ну і заодно краще збагнути сучасну українську проблематику. Тому величезне дякую за сьогоднішню зустріч і готуємо цікаві питання до пана професора.
Thank you very much, Denis Volodymyrovich. Dear Metью, should I a little bit translate? So it was...
Well, you can.
It was a great word of greeting from Professor Zhuravlyov to you, and we are very happy to have you. And on the part of the Faculty of History, Professor Zhuravlyov greets you, and we are very happy to be privileged to have the Western vision of the processes we are experiencing nowadays, our country is going through, and we would very much welcome your insight into the processes of decolonization and desovietization in Ukraine. And this is most precious to have such a great person having such an acute interest in the history of Ukraine, being brought up in the Western world and having such acute depth and insight into the problems of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history, and Ukrainian society, which is most important and most crucial for our Ukrainian present situation. And we are most happy and grateful to have you with us. And we are looking forward so much to your fantastic talk. Thank you so much. It's a privilege.
Дякую.
Faculty of History greets you.
Дякую.
As well as the whole university.
Ще,
Thank you so
щиро
much.
дякую.
Щиро
Добрий
дякую вам.
день. Добрий день. Все буде Україна. If you don't mind, I will give most of my commentary in English, but I'm happy. I understand Ukrainian perfectly well, and I speak Ukrainian, but I'm out of practice. I haven't been to Ukraine for some time. So you can certainly pose questions to me in Ukrainian if you prefer. So thank you, Professor Leheda and Professor Zhuravlyov for this kind invitation. And thank you to Kharkiv National University. It is such a pleasure to be here. I cannot imagine the conditions that you're operating under. I tell my students about universities in Ukraine every week, and now I will most certainly relay information about our meeting because I think it's inspiring to them. It's important that we as American professors and experts on Ukraine continue to talk about the plight of Ukraine, the dangers that Ukraine faces, and its struggle. It is a relentless effort on the part of people like me to do so, because in the United States, although there is very strong support for Ukraine, you can tell with the year anniversary, there's voices of doubt that are beginning to rise more in our political environment. And so I view it as my mission to continue to speak about Ukraine. I told Professor Leheda that I cannot possibly do my work without my colleagues in Ukraine. This work, all that I've accomplished as a scholar is with the help of fellow historians, librarians, and archivists. So it is my distinct pleasure to be with you. And I'm very, very grateful for the invitation. So I promised to say a bit about myself at the beginning, and then I'll give a brief summary of my findings in this book that you had an excerpt of. You had a chapter that was perhaps circulated, as well as the conclusion of the book. I don't want to get into well, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has, but I don't think it's my place necessarily to give you a full-on detailed academic lecture. So I would like to talk about the book, I suppose, in the context of the moment, the historical moment that we find ourselves in and that Ukraine finds itself in. And then very much I would entertain whatever questions you have about what you read, what I've spoken about, or just generally my interest in Ukraine. So as you both rightly noted, I come to Ukraine as someone who has no Ukrainian background. I simply became fascinated with Ukraine initially as a student of Russian, like many Americans at my university. The only Slavic languages taught, I went to Northwestern University for my undergrad. It's a leading university in the country, but it's based in Chicago, just north of Chicago, in a city called Evanston. And I studied Russian there. I studied Russian all 4 years. I studied in Moscow, but I studied with Ukrainian Americans because there's a very large Ukrainian American population in Chicago. And I find myself employed at this university, Michigan State University, not so far away from Chicago, when we have a large Ukrainian American population here as well, particularly in the Detroit area. There's Ukrainian cathedrals, and there's been a pretty strong response on the part of the Ukrainian American community to the war. I shouldn't even, I mean, it's not even pretty strong. It is vociferously strong response. So there's something called the Ukrainian American Crisis Group that I've helped support. And I'm lucky to teach in a state where I have the backing of the Ukrainian American community, and frankly, many Americans who have no connection to Ukraine whatsoever. So I'm speaking to you from Michigan. I thought it incumbent upon myself to offer you a little map of where I am. So it's the capital. Our university is in East Lansing. It's a university town just east of the capital of Michigan. Lansing's the capital. It's dead center in the state. This would probably not come across on Zoom very well, but Michigan is, there's two parts to Michigan, but the Lower Peninsula is has the shape of a hand. So we often point to where we live in the state of Michigan as a result, and we live right dead center, as I say, as you can see on the map. So I thought I'd talk a little more about, as I promised, my evolution as a Ukrainian scholar. So you can maybe pick me out. Find me in this picture, very young. This was when I was a graduate student in Kyiv, conducting my first initial research on the topic of Ukrainizatsiya, continuing my study of Ukraine, of Ukrainian language. So I started my very first year in graduate school. I went to graduate school at Indiana University, which is the leading center of Slavic and East European studies in the United States. And my first class was a history of Ukraine, if you can believe it or not, taught by a professor who is of Japanese background. Indeed, a citizen of Japan. He's American citizenship as well now, but Professor Haruki Koramiya, who is an expert on the Donbass. So he wrote a fabulous book called Freedom and Terror in the Donbass that I still recommend to Americans that they read, because it is a complex, nuanced history of the Donbass, an area that Americans frankly don't understand very well. Anyhow, my first year of graduate school, I found myself in this small course on Ukrainian history, and he motivated me to continue studying Ukrainian. I studied first Russian, and then actually studied Polish for a while, and then Ukrainian. I studied in Lviv through a program offered by the University of Kansas, and then studied at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute for the summer, and then went to Kyiv and had an amazing, I was at Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv, associated with the history faculty on a stajovanya, but I had money for language study, and frankly, I needed it because my Ukrainian was still, I felt, quite rough. Mostly, I felt spoke of some sort of version of Sarzik, right? I automatically put in Russian words when I failed to recall a Ukrainian word that I needed to use. So I had an amazing, I initially enrolled a course there for foreigners in Ukrainian language. And I have to admit, it wasn't all that good. It was mostly for foreigners who knew Russian quite well. And it was an attempt to sort of explain the differences between Ukrainian and Russian. It really didn't teach conversational Ukrainian or frankly Ukrainian for use as a scholar. So because of some money I had with a grant, I hired a tutor through the philological department at Taras Shevchenko University. And she was absolutely amazing. I stay in touch with her to this day. And she gives me, frankly, the most frequent updates on what is going on in Kyiv. I have good friends and historians in Kyiv as well, and I'm amazed how historians continue to act like historians, right? This is one way, I think, at least I don't mean to put myself in your shoes in any way, but I do get the sense that my colleagues, particularly at the Institute of History, the things that they're posting on Facebook are really about the historical craft, right? About the discipline of history. They continue to engage the sources that they can engage in and to have debates about understanding these sources. So anyhow, I studied in Kyiv. That's where I perfected my Ukrainian. My Ukrainian was probably at my best then. And then I served in the U.S. Embassy. This was the old U.S. Embassy. I'm sure some of you maybe know the new U.S. Embassy, which is this amazing sort of complex outside the center of the city. This was much closer to the university. It was a very small building. It was the former Communist Party of a Rayon district of the city of Kyiv, and we worked in this small building, and many of the Ukrainian employees, actually not all, but many had to work in the courtyard and in buildings that were quickly set up there, really trailers. So it was tight quarters, but a hugely important mission of the U.S. State Department. Ukraine at the time, in the late 1990s, was the third largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, right, after Israel and Egypt. So the U.S. invested heavily in the future of democracy in Ukraine, the future of the rule of law in Ukraine. And since I was pretty proficient in Ukrainian at the time, I was given hidden responsibilities. I was appointed there through a fellowship from the Department of State called the Futsal Fellowship. But my Ukrainian was better, if I may say, than those who'd been trained by the State Department for work in Ukrainian at the time. And so I was given the human rights portfolio, and I authored the annual country report on human rights, and the International Religious Freedom Report, these things that I was able to talk about when I left the State Department, because they're all declassified, they're all publicly available. So this is in the early 2000s, during the time of Kuchma, the time of President Kuchma, that I was there. Fascinating work, and I traveled all around the country in advance of the 2002 parliamentary elections, which were, I view, hugely important elections that prepared the way for the Orange Revolution and ultimately Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity. So that was my work. I also did a lot of cables back and forth about mostly freedom of the press, because I came there soon after the killing of Hohori Gongadze. And the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government in general was quite sensitive to the issue of violence against journalists and violence against the press and issues of freedom in the press in general. So that's what I found myself reporting on most frequently through diplomatic cables. And then, as I said, I did work for in advance of the 2002 elections. I was an OSCE election observer in Western Ukraine in the city of Lviv, and I returned in 2006 for the parliamentary elections then, and I was placed in Sokal in the far western part of Lviv Oblast. And we went up and down the Polish border, which has become a hugely consequential border, obviously, during the course of this horrific war that Ukraine faces now. So these are also old pictures. I don't have so many pictures of my life as a Ukrainianist, but here is at an earlier time. I have a lot of pictures now because everything's digital, and whenever I do an academic talk, there's image associated with it. But here is younger me as well, as an election observer in Sokal. With it's quite interesting. When you work as an election observer for the OSCE, you're paired with some other delegate from a member state of the OSCE. Some of you probably know this. Maybe you've even helped when the OSCE has conducted election observations. And there was a Russian delegation in Lviv with us, and I don't know. I don't know how they were paired, because I had the sense they kind of kept to themselves. But I was paired with a young Polish woman, and then there was, in our small little group, I don't think I have the picture of the whole group, there were two representatives from the Netherlands. But I thought it was quite interesting because we were supposed to work in English through a translator, right? Even though I knew Ukrainian, and it was pretty good at the time, and she knew Polish, and everybody speaks Polish there, but we continued to operate in English. Occasionally she'd use Polish, which led to interesting conversation. But anyhow, traveled throughout this very rural part of the far western portion of Ukraine, and I use this experience. I use it in the classroom, quite frankly. I teach history of international relations of the 20th century, so I teach about it all, but I end with my experience in Ukraine, as a former diplomat. And then during President Trump's first impeachment trial, I felt it incumbent upon myself to speak out about the questioning of American support for Ukraine. So I authored this piece. This is a website. You're welcome to find it. I put and I'm very happy to share whatever links you might be interested in. But it's an internet journal or internet magazine called The Conversation that most major universities, all the major universities that you can think of in the United States, Harvard, Yale, University of Michigan, Michigan State University, University of Chicago, they all support. And it's a way for us as scholars to try to translate what we know to the American public. And because of this so-called perfect, I don't want to get too political, but so-called, as President Trump called it, the perfect phone call with President Zelensky. It's sort of characterized, that whole affair seemed to characterize Ukraine as almost not a real state. And obviously, as a Ukrainian specialist, I objected to that. And I objected to this idea that this was in any way a partisan issue. In my view, support for Ukraine has always been a bipartisan issue. Both Republicans and Democrats have long invested in democracy in Ukraine. Now, you can view that maybe somewhat cynically, as some Americans are wont to do, but it's hard to argue with the numbers that the United States has long supported Ukraine. And so I reflected on my role in that, and my advocacy for Ukraine and for freedom of the press, for human rights, for the rule of law, for democratization in Ukraine. And that's what the piece is about. When I worked in the embassy way back in the early 2000s, my ambassador was Ambassador Pasquale, but his deputy chief of mission, so the second in command, was future Ambassador Yovanovitch, Marie Yovanovitch, who was ousted by Trump. So I when I had a Fulbright in Odessa, she was the ambassador at the time, and I met her at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, and she also came to Odessa where I was, and it offered an opportunity, I think, to reconnect with her. But also, my piece starts out with a description of a speech that she gave in Odessa at the time. So you're welcome to look at that. In the aftermath of my diplomatic work, I returned to academia and gained a position in the history faculty, history department at Michigan State University. Can be translated into multiple ways. There's two main universities in the state of Michigan, University of Michigan and Michigan State University. We're one of the original land grant universities. That is, the U.S. government gave this land to the university creators to create a university, in particular for, at the time, in the 19th century, for first generation university students. It's a beautiful university. I say that as somebody who has been trained, frankly, in the Midwest and traveled a lot around American universities in this part of the country, and I still love our campus. So this is the overhead shot of the university, and this is where our history department is. So my colleagues in the history department at Kharkiv University, you're welcome. I hope to see you here someday, and I hope we can build upon this conversation that we're having now and strengthen ties. We have a wonderful history department. I do most in the way of teaching about the history of the eastern part of Europe, but I say it carefully. Frankly, I try to deconstruct Cold War understandings of what this means with my students, and I teach about all of Europe as well, and Ukraine's place in it. So one of the other books that I'm working on right now, I have a contract to write a textbook on 20th century history of Europe, in which I place Ukraine continually at the center of that conversation. So the book is organized around particular moments or years, and then I have a co-author. We pick different cities to talk about, And Kharkiv is one of these cities that that features quite prominently in the manuscript, this evolving manuscript. Much of it still has to be written, but anyhow, I teach broadly European history, but most certainly history of Ukraine. And I try to get that across to my students as much as possible, that when we talk about the history of the Soviet Union, which is a regular course I teach, that that it is not just the history of Russia. And I teach also, I think of importance to the war now, history of the Second World War. History of the Second World War. And we know about the way that Putin has weaponized the history of the Second World War. And my students, frankly, don't have a very good understanding of the history of the Second World War in Eastern Europe. They really don't. I would say there's a definite proportion of them who don't know much about the Soviet role in the Second World War. But if they know something, they generally reduce it to Russia. And frankly, that appears in a lot of history books written in the United States in English. The authors often just simply use the word Russia, right, as opposed to the Soviet Union, totally ignoring the millions of Ukrainian, by the count of the Ukrainian government, 7 million ethnic Ukrainians who served in the Red Army and fought the Axis powers, fought the Germans and the Romanians. So it's my mission to tell them this history, and we keep on talking about Ukraine's role in the history of the Second World War. All right, so this is that's my evolution as an American Ukrainianist, who has no Ukrainian background. I just loved the history of Ukraine. I loved studying Ukrainian. I generally, when I've been back to Ukraine, I almost always use Ukrainian, even in Odessa. And when I was last there, frankly, it was a lot more Ukrainian. I heard a lot more Ukrainian, and people. I'm telling you something you already know, but I have to tell it to American students all the time who don't frankly appreciate what the Ukrainian language is. I generally try to stick to Ukrainian, because if I don't, I get muddled in my head, but it also just allows me to continue to try to perfect my Ukrainian, which we probably should meet again and have a conversation to Ukrainian, and you could tell me my mistakes and help me improve. But it's a never-ending process, I think, as a foreign speaker. We're continually trying to learn how to speak better. And one of the problems, of course, about studying Ukrainian in the United States is there's so few resources to do so. So my students, frankly, don't have an opportunity, I think, relatively easy to do so, although there's more opportunities that have sadly been created by the war. But there's greater interest, and more Americans are dedicating themselves to the study of both Russian and Ukrainian. I don't think we should ignore Russian, but most certainly, I think we should study Ukrainian. So my book, this is the translation that is most frequently used. It comes from a quote that I encountered in the newspaper Narodny Ochito, which was the mouthpiece of the Ukrainian Educators Union, Robos. It essentially references the resistance that some teachers created or embodied with the requirement to teach in Ukrainian. So this is also a cartoon from that newspaper, and you get the idea. I don't need to explain it to you as I do, I suppose, to my students, but it says "Szczepienia dla tłstoszkiernik," right? So vaccinations for the thick-skinned, and this is a teacher, right? Pictured as a hippopotamus who's resisting the idea. If you can see the vaccination or the shot, quite, I suppose, topical for this moment that we've been in and over the course of the past 3 years with vaccinations. It says Ukrainizacja on the vial. So he's being instructed to teach in Ukrainian and prepared to do so as a result of this vaccination. but clearly has resisted the idea of engaging in Ukrainian up until this point. So the world that I occupied in this study, I'm very happy to say it's quite, you read maybe a chapter if you had the opportunity to do so. It's a quite thick book. There's 12 chapters in total, and it finally came back out in paperback this year, and I was very happy that it did. And many more people can read it as a result. I think it's a book that was largely read by people such as myself, people very interested in Ukraine, specialists on Ukraine, but not the general American public, or frankly, not my historian colleagues who don't work in Ukraine. But now many more are picking up books such as this. And this world which I inhabited for so long was Soviet Ukraine in the 1920s. In 1930s, this is a map that Michigan State University created for me after much debate, because as those of you who study this period know, the administrative divisions of Ukraine changed all the time, right? They went from guberny to okruhi to oblasti. And so this is just a snapshot of one moment in time in 1927 when things, at least I could locate what things looked like then. But this is the world I knew and came to know intimately and write about at length in this book. And I view it as a retort to this. So forgive me for not putting it in Russian. I kind of quickly cobbled together some slides here. But I think my students need to understand this. So I speak about this moment because my students may know it, or if they don't, they understand the essential impulse. And even if they don't get that, they do, I think, have often in their brains this idea that Ukraine is no different from Russian, right? So our central mission as specialists is to explain the difference between Ukraine and Russia. But, Putin said on February 24th, modern Ukraine was entirely and fully created by Russia, more specifically the Bolshevik communist Russia. This process began practically immediately after the 1917 revolution. And moreover, Lenin and his associates did it in the sloppiest way in relation to Russia by dividing and tearing from her pieces of her own historical territory. Totally flawed, perverted, mistaken reading of history, right? And I view my work as somewhat, more than somewhat, frankly, a rejection of that idea. Of course, what Americans don't understand is that Ukraine has already been through a period of independence as formal state in modern independence in the modern era. So I introduced them to this moment. I spent a lot of time in this Budinok Vychitaliv in Kyiv doing research for this book. So I view my own historical interests as coincidental with Ukrainian first statehood as well. But I was motivated to write a piece about this moment of the first period of Ukrainian independence in the same internet journal called The Conversation. And I don't think it's too much, I don't think it's too unprofessional for me to admit that the editors for this journal wanted me to prepare an essay for when Kyiv was to fall, right? They expected Kyiv to fall to Russian forces. And I said, I don't think that's in any way a certainty. This appeared in March of last year. So soon after the full-scale invasion, March 16th, if you can read the date on it. And it is all a reflection of this first period of independence, which I argue in the book, that Ukrainizatsiya, Soviet Ukrainianization, is a response to this moment, right? The Soviets had to Ukrainize because Ukrainians resisted Soviet control so strongly, not ultimately successfully, but strongly, right? As I tell my students, Kyiv changed hands over a dozen times, and it took 3 Soviet governments to finally get Ukraine to submit to Soviet rule. So, in the aftermath of this war, I think the descriptor Russian Civil War is a misnomer, right? Because the war took place all over the former Russian Empire, but most certainly much of it took place in Ukraine. In the aftermath of the war, the Bolsheviks were obliged to recognize Ukrainian identity. So Putin's entirely wrong, as you all well know better than me. Ukraine existed for a hell of a lot longer than just the declaration of Ukrainian independence by the Central Rada and the Ukrainska Narodna Respublika. It existed before that moment, but it certainly existed then. And Soviet Ukrainianization was a reaction to the reality of Ukraine and to the reality of the Ukrainian nation. Ukrainizacja, I have no doubt that many of you read parts of its history. Ukrainizacja was a way to sort of disarm the specter of Ukrainian nationalism that the Bolsheviks feared, but also a way to most certainly legitimize Ukrainian Soviet Ukrainian rule, Soviet rule over Ukraine through the language that nearly 80% of the population claimed as their rідна мова, their native tongue, right? That's what they set about doing, but it's because Ukraine was already there. And schools were absolutely critical to this effort. So many people have written, even before me, about osvita, školy, and aspects of education. But what I do in the book is I go through a highly detailed analysis of what actually happened at the local level in schools, right? What happened to particular schools, what happened to schools in particular regions, in particular cities, and how parents and teachers and children reacted to the transfer of language of instruction to Ukrainian. So none of the Soviet policy of Ukrainianization could have been successful without schools. Schools were the building blocks for the policy, and of course schools meant not only to teach children Ukrainian, but to create Soviet citizens, right? Ukrainianization was not a mimicry of a sort of pre-Soviet understanding of Ukrainian, or of Ukraine, but in fact, it was an attempt to create, through the Soviet guise, a modern proletarian-centered Soviet Ukrainian identity, and this was done through the schools as well. So what I investigate in the schools is not only the transfer of instruction to Ukrainian, but the radical pedagogical things that the Soviets tried to achieve, right? A labor-oriented curriculum, which was meant to prepare Soviet Ukrainian children for participation in the socialist Soviet economy, and to do so in an early age. So even specialists on education in the Soviet Union and the United States who write about the Russian experience don't understand this. They don't understand that Ukraine had a obviously separate Commissariat osvity, but had its own separate educational system as well, which introduced some amount of vocational training, professional training at the secondary level. So in the early teens, or with early teenagers, but this reflected itself in the way in which education was pursued at the primary school level as well, right? So primary schools for the youngest children, prepared children for ultimately a role in vocational training and a role in which they'd enter the labor market at an early age, all done because of a recognition that the economy was destroyed after the war, and Soviet Ukraine needed to build socialism at a quicker pace, or at least that was the perception. So my view is that this was a real effort. I argue with other historians about this, because not everybody shares this view. But I think if you actually examine the Ukrainizers, that is, people that were tasked with converting the language of instruction in the schools to Ukrainian, and to ensure that government employees used Ukrainian and went through Ukrainian language training and went through Ukrainian language tests as well. If you look at that, you will see that a tremendous amount of effort was expended in this way. So I don't view it, I think teachers who are often Ukrainian-speaking teachers who embrace the policy of Ukrainianizatsiya, they were absolutely critical, because not only did they teach children Ukrainian, but they were also often responsible for teaching government employees Ukrainian, and they often tested their knowledge as well, right? So you, as a government employee, would have to take an exam in Ukrainian. It was often a public school teacher, a primary school teacher, that would be on the commission, that would be testing, that would be examining these tests. So in my view, these people had no idea that this policy was going to end or to be fundamentally altered. They believed in their role, and believed in that their role was real and consistent with Soviet ideals at the time. So there's a lot written about the way in which the Ukrainian national intelligentsia, particularly in Kharkiv and other major cities in Ukraine, were monitored by the GPU, and the police were concerned about what Ukrainizers were doing and what school teachers were doing. And I think that's all correct, but it is incorrect in my view to say that the Народний комісаріат освіти didn't believe in Ukrainianization. It did. And it spent whatever money it had towards that effort and employed a lot of people to try to Ukrainize, to affect a language transformation in Ukraine. All right, so what is in yellow is my big argument in the book, which is, before I wrote this, at least in English, there was a lot written on Stalin and the leadership of the Communist Party, and we'd examine Politburo documents and things like that. But we didn't really go down to the local level and examine how this policy was pursued. And that's what I tried to do in the book. So just some quick pictures, if you indulge me. Kharkiv appears in these pictures. So this is Cherkasy, but not Kharkiv. But this is my attempt to remind you that this policy of Ukrainizatsiya was dovetailed in English. What would be the Ukrainian word? I don't know if I could translate it easily, but married to the policy of Sovietization, right? And the creating of a modern, labor-oriented economy. And so you see this in the rural setting, right? Where children in rural schools were taught about particular notions of labor in Ukrainian, but also in the urban setting, such as in Kharkiv. This is a conventional labor school, but they're learning, I suppose, carpentry here, right? They're learning a craft. They're learning a trade within the context of the school through the Ukrainian language, right? Just as they're learning Ukrainian at the same time. I say this was incomplete Ukrainianization because what I found is often teachers, some exceptional teachers, devoted teachers, knew Ukrainian quite well and took up the task of Ukrainizatsiya. But as the cartoon that I showed you suggested, many did not, many resisted, and they certainly resist the requirement that they continue to demonstrate their fluency in Ukrainian, right? They didn't like having to take tests. They didn't like actually showing that they knew Ukrainian and knew Ukrainian effectively. And so the archival material that I looked at, as well as the published material, is all about how knowledge was imperfect. And in fact, teachers used a mix of teachers who had been trained in pre-Soviet days were more comfortable teaching in Russian and used Russian, or used a mixture of the two. And so Ukrainizatsiya, despite the fact that in tables and statistics, it seemed like a lot of schools transferred over to Ukrainian language instruction, in actual fact, the quality of instruction wasn't very good. The quality of instruction in Ukrainian wasn't very good. So it was incomplete in that sense. It was also incomplete in the sense that that many children did not go to full 7 years of schooling, and the expectation for them to become fully trained Soviet citizens who understood Soviet labor culture, but also understood the Soviet sanctioned form of Ukrainian. Many of them didn't reach that level because they only had maybe 4 years of schooling. And this was a particular concern for Narkomos, for the Commissariat of Education, as it applied to ethnic Ukrainian children, because often, particularly ethnic Ukrainian children who came with their families to cities from the countryside, didn't attend school, didn't attend full 7 years of school, or didn't attend schools regularly. So in my view, it was kind of a half-baked policy, right? It wasn't a fully formed, fully developed, fully achieved policy. The policy relied on children, such as the children pictured in this photo, to sort of apply pressure to teachers, and also to apply pressures to, like, the schools you read about in the chapter I provided, to schools that were in the center of the cities that had been elite schools in the Imperial Tsarist period, and were now being converted to Ukrainian instruction, and the old elites rejected having to teach their children in Ukrainian. So the idea was that Ukrainization needed to be about the transformation of the entire Soviet environment. All right, quickly, I want to leave time for discussion, and I don't know, sorry, Alya. Just quickly, so you have an understanding of the way in which I see these things pictographically, at least. I always talk about this photo with my students because it's a representation of Sovietization, but also Ukraine, right? Because the girls in particular are wearing Ukrainian national dress. This was a school that was the first gymnasium in the Ukrainian People's Republic era, and then became a Taras Shevchenko labor school #1 in Kiev. These teachers all got in trouble. These teachers were all repressed by the Soviets. Dodrakivsky is the bald man here with this striped tie, who was accused of leading a nationalist plot against the Soviets. Complete fabrication, but nevertheless, that's what he was accused of. And my argument is, as you see, these are my own titles translated, that this whole policy relied upon people. That's what's amazing about all this. Like, it wasn't it was a policy ordered from on high, but it only happened because of teachers, such as the teachers that are pictured in these photos. Here you can see how it's becoming even more Bolshevik, right? You can read millions of young Leninists are essentially the best legacy of Lenin, of Vladimir Ilyich. But it doesn't happen without teachers. All right, lastly, and I'll maybe end on these couple notes. All this, my view of this policy comes to a rather early end. American historians argue that it continued into the 30s. And I examine the early 30s. I examine up until this infamous judgment by the Communist Party of Ukraine's view that the chief danger to Soviet power in Ukraine was represented by Ukrainian nationalists, right? But that doesn't come about until 33, 34. I actually think the whole policy is sort of damned in this moment of the SVU show trial. Spilka vyzvolenia Ukrainy. When teachers were put on trial, the best teachers, the best Ukrainizers, those who were leading the policy of Ukrainianization were put on trial. And so when teachers already resisted, and this was one interrogation file that I examined of one SVU defendant, when the best teachers were being told that they were doing things wrong, in fact, they were doing things so wrong that they were going to be arrested and put in exile and repressed by the Soviet government, most teachers made the judgment this whole policy is not worth pursuing. But that doesn't mean it didn't have legs for a time. So this I was quite happy to find this document on Odessa. This is a test that a teacher in Odessa took for Ukrainianization to demonstrate their knowledge of Ukrainian. And if you can read it, I don't know how well you can see it on your screen, but it says Dobra at the bottom. And the title of the essay is translated into English, is the meaning of Ukrainianization in a political and pedagogical sense. So they were being tested for their ability to write in Ukrainian, right? That's the premise of this test was, can I write fluently in Ukrainian? But they were also being tested about their political knowledge. And, you know, I'm not I've learned Ukrainian, but in no way would I qualify myself as somebody capable of teaching people Ukrainian. And in my view, the people that, I don't think I say this in the book, but my view in looking at these files was that people were in fact being judged more often than not on the grammatical mistakes or the grammatical perfection that they were demonstrating in such accounts, but in fact on their ability to advocate for Ukrainianization in a way that was amenable to the Soviet government. These are really rare. I read about these all the time in Central Archives in Kyiv, but to be actually confronted with handwritten documents written by teachers, it was quite revelatory. And I say Moshlevis because I think one of the chapters you didn't read, I used Odessa as a test case, as a sort of case study. And what seems clear is that parents were choosing to put their kids in Ukrainian schools because they recognize that knowledge of Ukrainian would offer their children success. And here are children leading the policy of Ukrainianization, I'd argue, in Kharkiv. This is a factory apprentice school, 7-year school. But if you look up here, it says a firm step towards Leninist national culture in Ukrainian, right? So, and here are the emissaries of Leninist nationalities culture, national culture, sorry. Nacionalna kultura, national culture. These children are the inheritors of that policy, the beneficiaries of that policy, and frankly, they know maybe Ukrainian in a better way than these factory workers who they visited. I don't know ultimately. My view of looking at these photos, these workers were probably frustrated by these kids showing up on the factory floor and telling them what to do. But to me, that's the hope that was there in the 20s, that the children, the next generation, would indeed continue push Ukrainianization. All right. I think I'll reserve this for discussion. I will simply say, as Professor Leheda says, this is my current project on Odessa. It's on children again. I'm very, very much interested in children's history. It's on children's welfare and Bezpritulny in Odessa. I had a Fulbright, which is a nice grant from the U.S. government to conduct some initial research there. And then I came back to the States, was ill for a while. And then the pandemic happened. and now the war, and I haven't been able to return. So I hope I will soon, but it really is immaterial. I'm writing on what I have, and I have some interest in publishing this book, and I hope it reaches fruition soon. But I am fascinated by the early Soviet period. I think we need to understand this period in the context that I provided for you, right? It's all this is enabled by Ukrainians, right? So it's one thing to say, oh, the Soviets managed this, right? And I think I look at the dark side most certainly of what happened, right? These teachers are ultimately Stalinist. They're inheritors of a Stalinist system, and in which Ukrainization meant a hell of a lot less. But they're told to behave this way because of show trials such as this. We can look at all that cynically, but I think we should also acknowledge that none of this happens without Ukrainians, right? So this is it's a Bolshevik or Soviet sanctioned policy, but it's Ukrainians, Ukrainian educators, Ukrainian teachers who inform what that policy was actually going to be, how it was going to be realized, what its content was going to be, how much Taras Shevchenko was talked about, and the like. So, in my view, decolonization of this history begins with an acknowledgement that Ukrainians were always instrumental to the policies that the Soviets enacted. They suffered from them, absolutely. But this moment, this little, I think people like me, but I think Ukrainian historians at the Institute of History are still fascinated with Ukrainizatsiya because of the potential that it represented, right? It could have, had this moment not happened, had teachers been given more trust, you could have had a truly Ukraina Movna Держава at a much earlier stage. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm very happy to entertain whatever questions you might have about me, about Ukrainoznawstwo in Штатах, or about my work in general. Proszę.
Dear Metью, we are so grateful. We are so grateful for this so meaningful, such insightful, and such a deep approach to this particular period of Ukrainian history that you have so kindly disclosed to us with your vision. We are extremely grateful. If you permit, I'll just give a couple of lines in Ukrainian for those who might have overlooked some of the things.
Yeah, I should just say, I can leave it on this too. Maybe you can read this as these Ukrainian, this is from snippets. Some of these slides are from a talk I gave at the Institute of History some time ago, and so I'm thankful to my colleagues there for giving me a good translation of my meaning. So Oksana Yorkova did this translation, so I want to give her that credit. And yeah, please translate also whatever you like.
Шановні друзі, перед тим, як ми перейдемо до такої цікавої дискусії, мені хочеться ще знов українською мовою подякувати шановного професора Метью за його неймовірну доповідь, його неймовірний внесок у дослідження нашої національної історії і трошечки підсумувати, що доповідь сьогодні розподілялася на дві частини, у якій професор Метью розповів нам про свою еволюцію як дослідника української історії, української культури, української національної ідентичності, про свій шлях, який він розпочинав ще у штаті Індіана, який є центром дослідження україністики, коли він продовжував свою роботу у нашому славетному місті Києві, у посольстві, коли він досліджував українські архіви, був стипендіатом Фулбрайту, також виконував неймовірно важливу роль, просвітницьку роль, значення якої він наголошує особливо. Це сталося у штаті Мічіган, де своїм, можливо, одним з найважливіших обов'язків професор Метью вважає те, що його спілкування з американськими студентами повинно доносити те, що дослідження України як незалежної країни з неймовірною національною ідентичністю, самобутністю, історією та культурою повинно бути цією противагою. І це саме боротьба професора Полі проти російської пропаганди, яку професор Полі пояснює американським студентам і показує історію, демонструючи великі набутки, які наша країна має на сьогоднішній день. І другою частиною цієї доповіді був дуже цікавий, мені здається, вам всім це буде неймовірно продуктивно дискутувати зараз. Момент у історії професор Полі наголошує саме роль українського суспільства, його боротьбу до незалежності, його постійну боротьбу до встановлення власної ідентичності, як той поштовх, що в принципі в результаті змусив радянську владу піти на шлях українізації. Це саме позиція професора Полі, тому що він наголошує саме на ролі українського суспільства, українських людей, які своєю боротьбою призвели до цього і досліджує цей процес у школах, у суспільстві, і так, як він відбувався у той період. Тому професор Полі у своєму спілкуванні з американськими студентами наголошує саме на ролі української боротьби за національну ідентичність як першопричини для встановлення українізації, яку ми зараз, я сподіваюся, з вашою участю і будемо обговорювати. Dear students, dear colleagues, dear staff, would you please, you're most welcome with all your questions, and we are happy to start this beautiful discussion. Would you please? Who is willing to? Diana, would you please do us, I'm leaving you the floor, do us a great favor, be the first to put a question to our dear guest. Thank you so much.
Kind of internet issues. I'm joining in thanking you for such an excellent lecture as well. And yeah, you've touched such an interesting topic. You've touched on such an interesting topic when you spoke about the relations between the United States and Ukraine. And I am, as an international economist, cannot pass by such an interesting topic. And could you expand the idea about the further development of relations between the United States and Ukraine when Donald Trump, and the Republicans come to power? Could you describe it and expand the idea? Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe I'll take a long-range view as a historian, not just focus on the Trump era. I mean, my essential argument in the piece was that that the U.S. gave a huge amount of money. You may not have felt it as Ukrainian citizens, or as you know, this my view is long range. So it begins really in the 90s under Bill Clinton, right? Bill Clinton comes to Kyiv, he makes a speech in Kyiv, and essentially argues that the United States will always be a partner in the development of democracy and the rule of law in Ukraine, and sanctions a policy that begins in Kyiv, but then spreads out through the rest of Ukraine and leads to the building of this major embassy, to this USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, this complex that begins to work with subcontractors in Ukraine to buttress Ukraine's democratic orientation. I think it was quite interesting for me in the Kuchma years, right? I mean, I don't know how you all feel politically, but it was difficult. Kuchma sort of tried to play both sides, right? The West, so-called West, and then Russia. But the murder of Hohoi Gongadze represented a real dilemma in American-Ukrainian relations that we had to navigate around, And so if I could just reflect on this sort of, I mean, for you and your generation, it's most certainly history at this point. To me, the fact that Ukraine held relatively free and fair elections in 2002 for Verkhovna Rada, it meant that parties that were opposed to Kuchma, that were not afraid of speaking out against Kuchma, got into parliament and had immunity from prosecution. And so for me, that fact is important to remark on, and people in the US who are fixated on the current moment don't understand this long-range trajectory of the way in which democracy was built up over the course of time with the full participation of Ukrainians, right? That in no way is this, I mean, the US supported it, but is in no way a product of the United States, right? It's something that Ukrainians constructed by their own commitment to democratic expression and in voting in the way that they did in the parliament. During the Trump era, I felt, I don't remember honestly enough of all the things that became and that were integral to the impeachment trial against Trump. But certainly there was this idea, right, that Trump was kind of proposing that U.S. support for Ukraine was contingent, was dependent on the Ukrainian government sanctioning him and his policies, right? So I think that was disconcerting for professional American diplomats like Ambassador Yovanovitch. And it was certainly disconcerting for all these American diplomats who showed up at the impeachment trial in Washington, D.C., or the impeachment proceedings in Washington, D.C., in front of the House of Representatives, and started talking about the way in which Americans have long been engaged in the support of Ukrainian democracy. I think I remember talking about it with students, and this was the first time that that Americans began to hear Kyiv, right? Nobody used Ukrainian pronunciation or spelling of the capital city of Ukraine, even though officially we did in the embassy, but nobody back in DC, the New York Times didn't do it, the Wall Street Journal didn't do it until this moment where these diplomats showed up in Washington, DC and began talking about Kyiv. And suddenly the press had to adjust and American politicians had to adjust, and they had to accept, I think, a much more real idea of what Ukraine was. So I'm sort of going about your question in a roundabout way, but my memory of it is that there was this idea that was unfortunately propagated by the Trump White House that Ukraine was a sort of banana republic, if you forgive the expression, right? It's not a real state. It's just an appendage of Russia in which maybe the US can finesse certain things to the benefit of the current administration, rather than being a full-form state in which democratic expression had long been realized. So that's what came under duress. Obviously, Yovanovitch got herself in trouble supporting anti-corruption endeavors on the part of the Ukrainian government, about which you have much better informed and stronger opinions than I, because we can tend to over-romanticize all this too much, right? But what is certainly true is there's no doubt that Yovanovitch believed in the democratic course of Ukraine and viewed herself as instrumental in ensuring that corruption, to the extent that it could be expunged from Ukraine, the US was going to support that effort because it was ultimately to the benefit of Ukraine and benefit of Ukrainian democracy. And my own feeling is the Trump administration blurred the lines of all that, right? And they really didn't understand that in fact Ukraine was real. Ukraine was a real democratic state, and Ukraine had benefited from the support of Clinton and then Bush, and then Obama, all these, we've had White Houses that have switched political parties, and the through line in all this is investment in Ukrainian democracy. And I mean, I'll end on this last note that I find myself in a position as a specialist. I act as a historian. I like talking about history, as you saw today. That's ultimately what I do. But I comment on Ukrainian affairs all the time as well. And I find myself now, particularly as we reach the year anniversary of the war, defending U.S. expenditures for Ukraine's defense. And there are just too many voices that still don't get it. They in the United States. I think they're a minority, and they come from the extreme left and the extreme right of our political spectrum. But they even go back to Maidan, right? They go back to Revolucja Hidnosti, and they view it, particularly on the left, as sort of CIA plot, right? Totally failing to understand that thousands of Ukrainians came to Kyiv. This was their revolution, and the solidification of a democracy that happened in the aftermath of that revolution was a product of Ukrainian efforts, right? So I think this intersects with this moment that we're looking at in regards to the Trump White House, because I think it also exists on the right too, right? That this is the Ukraine's a sort of plaything between Russia and the United States, when in my view that is not at all true. But unfortunately, I think the way that the Trump administration through Giuliani, I'm getting maybe a little too political and revealing my political views, but yeah, they just felt they could finesse Ukraine in a way that would benefit in a very unethical way a particular party, a particular administration. So I'm glad for what has been on display since the full-scale invasion, that is largely bipartisan support for Ukraine. And there are still important Republican voices that are making clear that that is a priority. Obviously, there's people on the fringes that are beginning to express opposition to continued support to Ukraine, but I still think they're small. And I think it's incumbent upon us collectively in a forum such as this, but then me to continue to take whatever I hear from you and talk to the press and talk to the media and talk to my students. Because my students they're my students. Largely, they understand what I'm saying, but I've taught some courses in which I'm beginning to get a little bit of objection, right? And they don't necessarily acknowledge my authority as somebody who's long studied Ukraine. They view it as bias. And I have to say, no, these are in fact informed opinions. They're opinions informed by decades now of studying Ukraine. Not that I ever want to say that I understand Ukrainians better than Ukrainians. I don't, but I certainly understand Ukraine a lot better than a second-year student at an American university who's just discovered Ukraine, or has a buddy who's Russian in his fraternity, because we have rich Russians here too, studying in our university and other universities around, and they're not afraid of saying what they think about U.S. support for Ukraine. So thank you for the question, Diana.
Yeah, thank you for such a detailed answer. And it's quite fascinating to listen to the opinion of a person who really has an experience in the diplomatic area. Yeah, okay, yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the answer. That was a fantastic lecture in itself. Thank you for the retrospective and for the perspective of this answer, and for outlining the line between bias and informed opinion, which is so crucial for every society nowadays. And thank you very much for explaining that to the students who are so privileged to have you. We have our next student, Yulia Voskovoynik, who would wish to contribute to the discussion. Yulia, you're so welcome. Would you please? The floor is all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So my question is, Is it hard to you to find all the necessary information for your investigation on children in Odessa that you mentioned? Now, when you are not able to come to Ukraine like you could in the past.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Yulia. It is hard. I was able to, unfortunately, when I was in Odessa, I wasn't there that long, honestly. I was there for a semester, so essentially from September to January. And I was fortunate that the Oblast Archive allowed me to take photographs, so I took a lot of photographs. I've been working in that archive for years now, and I'm also strange because I'm a, Ukrainomовний Americanец. That's a curiosity to them, and I've often the previous deputy director of that archive would arrange for television interviews with me, in which I would have to speak Ukrainian. And at the time when I'm in Ukraine, it's much easier because I'm speaking it every day. So that was a fascination, and but they let me, they're very strict regime roboty, to the archival reading room hours, but they let me come most of the time unless there was something officially happening at the archive. So I was able to be there probably more than your average Odessan citizen. I felt a little bit guilty about that, but I'm a foreign researcher. I only have so much time there, and the reading. If you've been to Odessa, I haven't been to. I've been to Kharkiv. I was there with Jovanovic. Now this will date me, maybe to Diana's question as well. I was there on 9/11. So to me, every American knows where they were on 9/11 if you're alive then. I was in Kharkiv. I was in Kharkiv because we were opening an American friendship center, something like this. Kharkiv is a sister city to Cincinnati, Ohio, which is not too far away from me. It's where my family's from originally. My father and my mother are both from Cincinnati. And so we were there, and we were also doing some other things. But I've not been there as a historian, but I deeply remember that day. So I don't know I have good friends who worked in the Kharkiv Oblast Archive. It was always my aspiration to come to Kharkiv. So when the war is over, Peremoha Buddha, I will come and we will visit together in person, if you allow me.
It's our honor. We're so much waiting for that.
Yes, absolutely. I expect it. It will happen. But I haven't worked in the archives, and so in Odessa, the Oblast Archive is an old synagogue, Brodsky synagogue, that the Soviets seized in the 1930s, and it's truly just falling apart. And I haven't checked in on its status lately, but when I was there, birds would fly in and out of the reading room. It's really not good conditions, but amazing stuff there, amazing archival material, and amazing archivists, professionals. Top notch. So they were immensely helpful in giving me material. But during COVID, I asked for some files to be sent to me, but I could only order a few, and I had to obviously pay for them, quite rightly, but that took a while to sort out. I'm reasonably confident. I don't want to say too much, but major press wants this book. So until I get a contract, I probably won't announce it. But I think I have enough. There's a Naukova Biblioteca. It used to be named after Gorky in Odessa, and I think they've dropped the name altogether, obviously. They were amazing librarians there, and I got material, a lot of journal material, newspaper material from that library as well. So I hope I have enough, but I don't know what's going to happen. Some archives are beginning to open up, as those of you who are historians know. I don't know what the situation in Kharkiv is, but in Kyiv, the central archives are beginning to open up, not to foreigners necessarily, but I don't know. I suppose there's a possibility I may have to hire a research assistant to help me if Odessa truly opens up. Frankly, I'd love to do more with this study and go beyond Odessa. I mean, I think that it's what I'm trying to demonstrate. There's a lot of good work on bezpretulnost. There's really excellent dissertations written by Ukrainian students, and I'm a scholar who doesn't ignore those, unlike not everybody reads Ukrainian, right? Who works in Ukraine, I would say, foreign researchers, right? So it's hard for them to read Ukrainian kandidatska dissertations. Sorry for my grammar, but you understand what I meant.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I that's to me always the first thing you go for, and you benefit from collaboration with local scholars. And I have good colleagues. I was at the in the Kafedra as Истории Ukraine at Mічіганського University there, and I maintain touch with those folks as well. So maybe they'll be able to help me along as I encounter problems. But I have to get some material to this press that's asked for it. So it's going to be the summer reckoning for me. Obviously, the conditions are horrific for you. And so for me to complain is rather silly, but it is a challenge, I think, for foreigners. You see foreigners going back to Ukraine now, particularly in the summer. Foreigners would go, but not historians so much, because we can go when we can meet our friends, and I think that's good. And I think we can engage in charitable work to the extent that Ukraine needs that. I've always told my colleagues Ukraine needs money more than they need us, because Ukrainians are perfectly capable of carrying out their own charitable work. But you see Americans going back for that kind of thing. You see people that are interested in matters of current policy, maybe political economy, things along those lines, going back and meeting with governmental officials. But, you know, if I might defend my discipline, and for historians in the Zoom room, it takes work, right? It takes investment of time to learn these languages and to spend a lot of time sitting in Chitalny Zali, right? And just reading, and so that, to me, but that's good. I think that leads to better work. And I also think, frankly, when the full-scale invasion broke out, I was on media a lot. I spoke to major national broadcast television stations, so CBS, if you know the American media environment, and Deutsche Welle, Al Jazeera, all these places, advocating for what I knew, advocating for Ukraine. I'm always advocating for Ukraine, but I'm trying to provide expert opinion, not just, as we said, not just something that is a gut instinct. But I think part of that expert opinion comes from spending a long time in Ukraine. And unfortunately, I think sometimes foreigners who position themselves as Ukrainian experts, sometimes I don't think spend all that much time, right? They have quick meetings, and then they leave. And I just have noticed that in some of the talks that I've attended, where people are removed from the discussion, absurdly, in my opinion, right? Tragically, in my opinion. And so people are asked to predict the outcome of the war. And we can, I don't think I am confident in victory, but exactly how that's going to happen, I don't know. But what I know is that Ukrainians will achieve it. The Ukrainian armed forces will achieve it. And we should give every deference and attention to that. But we should also give every attention to the suffering of Ukrainians in Ukrainian cities like Kharkiv. And I sometimes find that sometimes analysts, particularly foreign analysts, talk in an almost anesthetic way, right? As sterile, if you understand my English, without emotion. And I think it's okay for emotion to be on display. Because it suggests something about your experience and about the very real human quality to the horrific war that you were facing. So anyhow, that's also a mini lecture, as you say, but we have challenges in particular as historians, I guess, is the sum of my statement, that it's just not work. I mean, there's more stuff available digitally, but really, there's so much more that needs to be converted. My colleagues who work like most history departments in the United States, most of my colleagues are historians of the United States, right? And their challenges are quite different than somebody like me. So I benefit from knowing people like you. I benefit from my other Ukrainian specialists in the country, in the United States and Canada. I've had support from the Shevchenko Society. They help support this book. And we do our best to continue to keep the voices centered on Ukrainians first and foremost, but also those who frankly didn't just discover Ukraine. The last thing I'll say in regards to historians is there's a lot of, Ukraine is an amazingly free place, right? I think actually historians who are willing to slow down will acknowledge this, even those I've debate other historians, right, about the origins of the war. And I think most people who know Ukraine know the truth. But there is a category of historians who write largely on the Soviet experience, right? And Ukraine is just a little bit of what, but they come to Ukraine because they have access to the SBU archive, right? They have access to the secret police archive, which they never would have in the Russian Federation. So they come, but then they leave. And so you sometimes confront these books that Ukraine is referenced, but not a specific sort of Ukrainian experience. That to me is unsettling, and I try to fight against those sort of narratives. So, if I reveal too much in a recorded conversation, I'll get myself in trouble. But too many universities in the United States do not have Ukrainian specialists, right? I mean, we're a small group of folks. So when the full-scale invasion happened, all these Russian experts came out, and sometimes they spoke, I think everybody's well-intentioned, but I don't think everybody understands Ukraine in the same way. By the way, there's a whole category of really great scholars, many of Ukrainian descent, but who've written on Kharkiv, and I have aspirations to learn even more. One of the things that I published on this Odessa project is a history of the fight against disease. And now I'm going to forget the name of the Kharkiv historian I consulted, but there's amazing scholarship on because of course Kharkiv was the capital. Amazing studies of the efforts against disease, the spread of disease that happened in the Soviet era in the city of Kharkiv. So I benefited. I cited in my work. If you're willing, if you're really interested in Odessa, I'm happy to provide Professor Leheda the link to this. There's this book. There's a journal called East West Journal of Ukrainian Studies. It's an interdisciplinary journal. And they published a special issue all on Odessa, and my piece is in that. So it's a kind of introduction to this larger book study. But it does through the Ukrainian prism, because Odessa is often also not considered part of Ukraine by many. All right, I've talked too much. We have Marta and Dimitro. I don't know who came first.
Thank you so much for that. Marta, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, how close like a language and culture connected? I mean, like taking English, for example, or something like this. Any other example as you can? I don't know.
I think they are connected. I don't think we should reduce it entirely. I mean, I always tell students and those uninformed about Ukraine that Ukraine is a multi-ethnic space, that just because somebody's speaking Russian doesn't mean is in no way a predictor of their loyalty. In fact, I mean, you know this. I have to tell Americans constantly that those who are fighting now, many are Russian speaking, and that the Russian army is destroying Russian speaking Ukrainians, right? So that's all well and true. And I think we should also just acknowledge the multi-ethnicity of Ukraine. When I worked for the embassy, I went to Simferopol and Bakhchisarai, met with Mustafa Jamilov in his home in Bakhchisarai, and was there for the commemoration of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars and wrote about it for the embassy. And so I think Americans also don't appreciate that as it comes to the question of Crimea as well. But, you know, I do think the Ukraine of the 1920s and 1930s, the people that were in charge of Ukrainizatsiya recognized that there is overlap between Ukrainian language and questions of identity. There's been other scholars that have come after me, Olena Palko, Mihail Fowler, who've written on sort of the cultural expressions of Ukrainizatsiya. So Mihail has written on theater, Olena has written, these are books available in English. I recognize there's a lot in Ukrainian. Olena has written on book reading and literature much more. And I think they would certainly argue that, you know, Mihail would tell you that there's sort of a transnational conversation that happens in a place like Kharkiv and elsewhere in Ukraine, where there's conversations about what Ukraine is in multiple languages, right? But they've also done a lot to accentuate what was produced in the Ukrainian language during that time. So I don't think we should ignore the synergy between language and identity. And I think it's right that we take time to honor Taras Shevchenko. He's facing me in my office now. You can't see him, but he's facing me, a portrait of Taras Shevchenko. They just had a major Shevchenko conference at Indiana University just last week. I think the 42nd iteration, I may have that number wrong, but so I think it's right to honor the Ukrainian language, and I think it's a good thing to speak it. Doesn't mean you exclusively speak. You don't need American telling you this, but it doesn't mean you exclusively speak it. You make your own choice. But I think knowing Ukrainian and using Ukrainian is a good thing regardless. And for America, I mean, I often get the question from American students. I mean, I get it. I just got it the other day. Is Ukrainian just a dialect of Russian? I mean, that is the general impression of Americans. And I say, well, then if that, no. And I cite all the linguistic data that I can. And I talk about my struggles to learn both languages well. And Ukrainian, for me, was my better language for a long time and remains so. But I also just, if that were the case, then everybody would be speaking beautiful Ukrainian, right? If they were all that interchangeable. I used this story in the New York Times that appeared about a month ago for my course in the Second World War, where they talk about Russians fighting for the ethnic Russians from the Russian Federation who are fighting for the Ukrainian army, and how they're having trouble understanding the instruction in Ukrainian. And so for me, that finally gets in the hand, especially of young men in a course on the history of the Second World War, that the language is different. But Americans want to conflate the two, and they just see Ukrainian. And I think it's hard because I show them Ukrainian stuff. I try to read things in Ukrainian on occasion to them, but most of them don't know either language. So it's hard for them to hear. And if they just look at the names of city, right? Kharkov versus Kharkiv, what's the big difference to them, right? But in fact, of course, it's way much more than the geographic places. So. Dmytro, I think, was next, and then.
Thank you so much, Metro. You're welcome with your question, please.
Okay, firstly, thank you for an interesting and very detailed lecture. Then I have a question. You mentioned the resistance to Ukrainization among teachers, and is it possible to notice a significant divergence of opinion or the strength of resistance regarding this Soviet policy of Ukrainization in the large cities of Ukraine, like Kiev or Kharkiv, and in the countryside?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Dmytro. It is, I will say, the archival material mostly regards cities, right? And one of the reasons I went to Odessa is because there was a fair amount in the central archives about resistance in Odessa, particularly. You know, honestly, there was less about Kharkiv in terms of resistance, although I'm sure I know it existed. And there's a particular fascination with the Donbass, given the Soviet efforts. You know, Soviet power is based in Donbass, and trying to. So my advisor, my mentor, wrote about the Donbass, and what he would argue is the Donbass rejects control of states in general. Now, that's a long-range historical answer, but it's certainly not necessarily pro-Russian. And even wasn't during this time of Ukrainization, but they did expend a special effort to push Ukrainian language culture in Stalino, Donetsk, and other places as well. But what is surprising, so that would be understandable, that would be predictable, right? That there'd be more resistance in the cities. Cities are more Russian speaking than the countryside. But what's amazing is, or surprising to me, is in fact, although there's battles about, if you read the chapter I circulated, focus on Mykolaiv, and in particular on this one school that's in the center, Mykolaiv, that the parents have invested money in, and they don't want it to convert to Russian. So there are battles, particularly for, I think, Ukrainization of not just the city, largely writ, but the center, the historical centers where the best schools were from imperial czarist times. So that's all well and true, but it's also true that the cities have the best resources. The cities have the best resources, and teachers want to teach in cities, because living in the village in Soviet Ukraine was not a really enviable job to have, right? So teachers are attracted to the cities. Ukrainizing teachers, Ukrainian speaking teachers are attracted to employment in the cities. And to teach, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the larger book is the way in which teachers were responsible for creating their own lesson plans and all that, right? So there's an emphasis on teacher-driven, or in fact, pupil-student-driven lesson plans, right? Which actually works with Ukrainization because it meant an abandonment of textbooks, right? Which were all in Russian. Anyhow, so it actually benefited the policy of Ukrainization, but you still needed some literature. And we've talked about the intersection between language and identity, right? So if you're going to read Shevchenko, but also Soviet Ukrainian poets and writers, you're probably going to have that access. You're going to have access to that information much more in the cities. So in actual fact, I would say that although there was resistance, there was also support, and key resources that enabled, until the political environment changed, enabled a continuation of Ukrainization in places like Kharkiv and Kiev, even Odessa, as I argue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We've got a question from Yelizaveta as well. Would you please?
Thank you for this interesting lecture. I want to ask your opinion about the politics of decolonization in Ukraine.
Yeah. So that's a great question. In no way do I position myself as an expert on this, so I'm offering you my anecdotal opinion. I think some amount of it is absolutely necessary, particularly in this environment that we find ourselves in a horrific war. I do think we don't want to ignore the history that I'm talking about, right? Because it's Ukraine's history as well, and as I argued, Ukrainian communists were instrumental to this policy, and so if we erase everything, then we lose that history. But I understand why it's happening. I understood why it was happening before the war, and when I was in Odessa for this Fulbright, it was all the way back in 2016, 2017, and I went to meetings. And I didn't ask questions. I just listened. And Odessans were quite, maybe the people that were most resistant to decommunization were the most vocal. So it may not be truly representative, but I do think, I think it's all, for me in many ways, so I don't understand why Lenin statues were, I try to tell my students, and frankly, my colleagues, like one of the things I really hate, talking the reference point that American media often uses as it regards Ukraine. They'll say the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine, right? Almost always, the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine. In my view, we can do away with the former Soviet Republic, right? Ukraine's long been independent, and if we project from 1918, like 30 years out from 1918, we wouldn't call former Habsburg provinces former Habsburg province of Bohemia or something like that. So I think we need to do away with a lot of that language as it regards the presentation about Ukraine, but in the American and foreign media environment, I think it's important as historians to acknowledge the Soviet past, but not be weighed down by it, right? So much so that it infects our whole language and the way we describe things in the present. As it regards Ukraine themselves, I guess my bottom line is I'll leave it to Ukrainians, but I certainly think my observations in Odessa is that things became most heated when they regarded the changing of names or of anything that had to do with the Second World War, right? And the taking down of war monuments and things like that. I think that's a lot more controversial, isn't it? But that's the nature. But maybe all that is changing now because of the way in which, I don't know, we need to do both things, right? We need to fight against this sort of ridiculous characterization of Ukraine as a Nazi state, right? And we do that by acknowledging a lot of things about Ukrainian in the present, but also its past, right? Ukrainian Soviet defiance of Nazi rule and Axis rule, and not just focus on the more complex history of the UPA and UN, which is the subject, I think, of a separate conversation. At the same time that we do that, I think we also have to acknowledge the very real pain and suffering that occurred under the Soviets, right? So the Holodomor, something Americans still don't appreciate enough of. So I guess I'm not going to offer you a definitive statement. Beyond that, I think some amount of it is a good thing, but it can be overblown. But I'm willing as a foreigner, first of all, to say I don't have any say in the process of it. But also, I think, during a time of war, we have to be careful. Maybe that would be my counsel if somebody asked me. Be careful how far you go, but it's understandable why calls are more strident now, and certainly you want to make sure that at least the rest of the world understands that Ukraine is not just a creation of Russia, and that communist rule was a complex historical period in which Ukrainians played a critical role, but Ukrainians also suffered as well. but it wasn't just an extension of Russia, right? So the first thing my students in the history of the Soviet Union get again and again is understanding what the Soviet Union was. And so, yeah, the more we can bring other Ukrainians into the narrative, right? And not just, I think we shouldn't maybe take away everything from the communist era, but there's people who have been ignored all along the way. And it's not just representatives of the sort of, how do I put this politely? There's many things that have been ignored about Ukraine's past that should be injected into the Ukrainian conversation. So I don't know how you feel about Pushkin. Like that would have been something that nobody would have attacked before, right? Taking down these statues, but I don't see why it's necessary. I don't know why you could have more statues of Ukrainian writers and the like. So yeah, it's a process, I think, that needs to happen, but should happen carefully so that we don't lose everything associated with the past.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizaveta.
Thank you so much. I think our students have the privilege of getting so many important things right now from you. Thank you so much for telling in such great detail about everything, about how you feel and how you teach. Dear students, dear friends, dear guests, Elizaveta, do you have another question? Would you please, I see your hand, or somebody else would like to follow. I also see Igor. Elizaveta, do you have a question? I see your hand. Maybe Igor? You're welcome, Igor. Please.
Thank you. You listen me, yeah? Okay. Thank you. It was very interesting to listen. In your opinion, which American government has supported Ukraine the most all this time? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'll probably reveal my political persuasion as a result. I generally vote Democrat, so which probably doesn't surprise you if you know something about American academics. But I mean, I'm quite. I hear from my Ukrainian friends, and I certainly heard the frustration in the early days of the full-scale invasion about the lack of the right kind of American aid under President Biden, right? The lack of there's a great call for closing the Ukrainian skies, for proper air support and all these things. And I think Ukrainians are quite right to argue, why do we have to keep arguing for things that you're going to give us in the end? But that being said, I'm fully supportive of what the Biden administration has done. I think it takes some bravery in the American political context to do so. I do think what I've argued, I'm happy to circulate my most recent comments on this subject that I gave to Al Jazeera. I think we need to do more than say we're just going to be with Ukraine till the end. I mean, yes, of course we are, but we need to define constantly what that means. And that means fighting for democracy. I mean, some Americans, I say these things and there's just, if you know the English word vapid, there's not enough there for them. So there's some people approach that cynically, but I actually really believe it. And I do believe that there's a security threat, and you have to talk about these things to Americans. So you have to say, and I think it's true, there's a security threat to all of Europe, most certainly, and a security threat to the United States as a consequence, as a result of Russian aggression. So I really do believe the Ukrainians are fighting a war in the name of Europe and in the name of liberal democratic values. And so I think the Biden administration needs to do a better job of explaining that, right? Rather than just saying we'll be there always. We need to explain why that's the case and why it's in the interests of Americans, because the more money that gets spent, the more Americans will begin to question those sorts of expenditures. I worked under Bush. I thought he was perfectly supportive of Ukrainian sovereignty. as well. So I wouldn't say, I do think the Trump years were a rather low point, is what I'd say. I'm glad I'm not an isolationist in any way. I never was before the full-scale invasion. We need to constantly remind Americans, of course, this war has been going on since 2014, and some would argue even before then. But I'm glad that there's an administration back in power that is in favor of working with the Euro-Atlantic community and sees the Euro-Atlantic community as in American interests, and America needs to play a role as a partner in these sort of multilateral structures. So the other thing that came to mind, and it just, when I worked for the embassy, my first conversation, when I flew into Kyiv, I was put up in my apartment on Andreyski Uzvi. It's the best apartment I will ever have in Kyiv. And I had a meeting soon thereafter, and the very first person I met was Petro Poroshenko, who was then a Verkhovna Rada deputy. So that was illuminating to me. He was a very different political creature at the time, but it says something about, again, the way that the United States, I was at the time a representative of the United States government, was engaged, frankly, in conversations with multiple parties, not just Narodny Ruch and, the bloc that ultimately came Bloc Yushchenko, but people like Poroshenko, who's had this political evolution over the course of his career. If you know, so many of you are way younger than me, so but you probably know this history. But we also spoke, I spoke to the Communist Party all the time. I met with emissaries of the Simonenko Communist Party and then Vitrenko variant thereof. I remember having a beer with the guy he spoke beautiful English, right? So he often met with the Americans in the Ukrainian Communist Party. And we met, I think it was the hotel, I don't remember. Honestly, I remember meeting Poroshenko in Hotel Dnipro, but it was called I think it used to be called the Hotel Lenin, the big hotel that was there over Maidan, and he refused to have Obolon beer because it was associated with the Ukrainian right, the Ukrainian right political spectrum. But he had a German beer, and I'm like, how is that? How can you do that as somebody who rails against, who is too ritualistic about the Second World War and the fight against German Nazis? A necessary fight, absolutely existential fight, a right fight to have, but it seems strange that he was going to pick the German beer over the Obolon beer. So anyhow, that's also more in the way of storytelling from me. But yeah, I know. I think if I had to pick, I do think Obama didn't do enough, is what I'd say, quite frankly, as it regards Crimea. I think not just the U.S. government didn't do enough to punish. I don't know. I don't have a definite prescription. I just know it was not enough. But I also think American academics, American scholars were sort of complicit in this, because I read too much in the aftermath of the annexation by colleagues where they argued, well, historically, it makes sense for Crimea to be part of Russia, right? And that speaks to, I think, the long-term legacy and weight of Russian-oriented scholars in the American Academy, if I may be frank and candid, right? There's many more people than me who are trained and who trained in Russian, whose work has long been centered in Russia. And we never want to reduce these things. As historians, we offer complex, critical discussions of the past, and we don't just fit into tropes. But at the same time, I think historians played a part in rationalizing the annexation of Crimea for the American public, or at least for the wider field of history, where it just seemed to make sense rather than looking at it and looking, I'm reading, Professor Lehida and I were talking about Professor Rory Finnan at University of Cambridge. I'm finally finishing his book, and it's amazing discussion through the prism of literature of the solidarity between Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and Turks, and all that history is ignored and not really well understood by people who long focused on just purely the Russian ethnic presence in Crimea and the imperial and Soviet legacy heretofore. So Biden good, Obama all right, Trump not so good in my opinion.
Thank you so much. So much food for thought. Thank you for telling us about this controversy and how this opinion was partially formed among American scientists, and how it was formed and what it pushed to. So it was most precious. I think our students of Faculty of History have so much to tell about today's meeting and have so much to think about. And we are so grateful when you showed this picture of your beautiful campus. We hope really hope that this first meeting, that your fantastic talk would give way to a much longer collaboration. We would be so much grateful for that. We hope for your visit very much. Dear students, do you have more questions, dear Metью? Is it okay if I ask, because you've given us fantastic 2 hours? Thank you so much. Щиро дякую вам. Do we have more questions, dear friends? They so
Veronica.
I'm so much impressed by what you've said. Veronica Jarosz, please.
Yes,
Go.
Thank you very much for this lection. And I have a question about actually this historical topic. You and your book, how can I understand with these events of 1934? So you touch on this book, this topic about this tragedy of the Ukrainian people from 1932 and 1933. And for me, it's interesting about this researching of this period from 1932 to 1934 about from this educational perspective, how it changed actually, and all this kind of things. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So when I wrote my PhD dissertation, I actually stopped in 30 because the archival files, largely as they regard Ukrainianization, are absent. It doesn't mean Ukrainianization wasn't occurring in that early 30s period, but it's very hard to find records about Ukrainianization in the schools in the early 1930s. And I think that's partly has to do with the SVU trial. I make that a centerpiece of my argument, both in the dissertation and then ultimately the book. I did a hell of a lot more research for the book. So there's whole chapters on young pioneers and the Komsomol, and I have this test case or case study on Odessa and much more. But it made sort of sense to stop in 1930 because of what I confronted in terms of surviving material in the archives. But also, there's from the pedagogical side of things, the education system changes, right? So Ukraine loses its distinctive education system, which had this earlier level of vocational instruction at the secondary level, what we call in the United States middle school or junior high school, right? The Ukrainian educational system merges with that of Russia, and there's a standard really for the entire Soviet Union. So Ukraine, you can I suppose from the perspective of the present, you might argue cynically that, well, that was all for the communists anyhow, and what's the point? But I think it is interesting that Ukrainians were in control of their own Ukrainian educational system, and it's a fact that's lost on many of my colleagues who long built careers writing about the history of culture, history of education in the Soviet Union. They don't know. In fact, I had a discussant when I was an advanced graduate student who didn't even know there was a separate commissariat of education that held up such a system. So in the aftermath of the unification of the Ukrainian and Russian educational system that begins in 1930, there's this period of the Cultural Revolution where there's still some experimentation, but everything that is that regards schooling and student activism in education is really tied to specific political tasks like collectivization, right, which leads to Holodomor, right? So students are involved as both the victims, but also participants in grain collections and the likes, or their families are, and their school directors are, and so forth. I have to write a paper on schools during the Holodomor, so I face this task in front of me for a conference at Columbia University in New York in September. So I'll refine my thinking in this regard. But then in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, there's a sort of conservative bent on education where textbooks are relied upon again, and you have the production of the kind of schooling that your parents know something about, or your grandparents know something about, which is kind of, we learn by textbooks and we memorize and we repeat in class, right? Which isn't the tradition of the 20s, is what I'd suggest to you. As a regard, so that's pedagogically what's happening. As regards to Ukrainization, I was, with some determined effort, to dig. In the history profession, we call it reading against the archival grain, right? So the archives, you get opusy and they say certain things, but then you have to sort of ignore what the opusy description is and dig further and look for information that may not be apparent at the first reading. And so I was able to find some more material. Partly, I did work on the young pioneers because there was more information on the young pioneers in the 1930s, and that gave me some insight. But I'd say generally what you found is there is discussion of Ukrainizatsiya, but it's all about, I'm going to mess me up at my Ukrainian here, Primosova Ukrainizatsiya, so forced Ukrainianization, right? There's a huge emphasis on the way in which ethnic Russians and Russian speakers are suffering because of Ukrainizatsiya. So even though the policy isn't abandoned, that there's very little in the way of positive reinforcements of the idea that Ukrainian linguistic culture was a good thing, and needed to be expanded and expanded up from the level of the primary school all the way up to the vuzi, to universities. So I have a good friend in Odessa who wrote a history of the Odessa Institute. They were called Institutes of Public Education, right? Institut Narodnej Osvity. They were very weakly Ukrainized. So you see in the early 1930s, a stoppage, a halt to any effort to expand whatever gains had been achieved at the primary school level, up through the hierarchy, up through the ladder of education. And as I say, even at the primary school level, many scholars, the most famous book on this subject is a book written by Terry Martin, who's a historian at Harvard, wrote a book called The Affirmative Action Empire, which is all about Korenizatsiya in general. And he argues that Ukrainization happened like that as it regards primary schooling. And my argument is the opposite of that, that it was in fact a policy that was wrought with a certain amount of tension, that was resisted, but also pushed as well. So there's a kind of push and pull to it, but it was not achieved overnight, and there's reasons for doubt that there was a true Ukrainian-speaking linguistic culture in schools in the way that the statistics suggest. So my argument of the 30s is there's no incentive to do any of that anymore. In fact, there's huge disincentive to do it, because if you did it, then you might end up like the teachers that were put on trial in the Kharkiv Opera House as part of the SVU show trial. So there's every incentive not to push Ukrainianization, even though officially the policy remains. And Ukrainian schools, as you well know, didn't disappear. They remained through the 30s and into the late Soviet period, but they're just not privileged in the same sort of way that they were in the 20s.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear audience. Thank you, dear guest. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for this fantastic answer, for this so consistent insight and deep insight into every possible problem we raise here. Dear friends, do we have more questions? Do we have more questions to our dear guest? I'm sure you have lots of things to think about. Dear Metью, can I thank you for everything on the part of our university, on the part of the history faculty, on the part of myself, deep honor, great honor. Although I'm not a historian, but I'm sure that all of those eager young minds who are present here today, they will have so much more to rely on in their future research, in their fight for Ukrainian independence, in their fight for freedom, in building their own philosophy of life. I think meeting someone like you is a cornerstone in life. It's a milestone. Thank you very much for that and for everything you've told us today. It's been amazing.
Proszę. If I could just add a few last words. I'm tempted to try my Ukrainian, but I'll use my English just a bit here. Just thank you so much. If you have any further questions, please give them to your professors, and I'm very happy to respond by email. I'm also very happy to connect through Facebook if you like.
With your kind permission, we will provide all the links. All the links will be provided to the Faculty of History.
And I really do hope, I hope you're able to come here someday, frankly. We have 2 Ukrainian students who came here on emergency scholarships to our university, but that's just 2. They're what we say in the United States undergrad. they're studying business and I think political economy, international relations. But I most certainly will come to Kharkiv as soon as I'm able to do so, and I look very much forward to that day. But thank you so much. Дякую за запрошення. Дякую за все.
Дякуємо вам. Ми будемо дуже на вас чекати. We're going to be looking forward to having you in our university. Thank you for telling us everything and for being with us for these 2 fantastic hours. And I'm absolutely sure that with your kind permission, when your email is given, you will receive so much feedback. Well, I think it will be an absolutely memorable event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professor.
It's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.